Welcome back. This is Unit 2, Part C. And as a quick refresher, we have been looking at the whole concept of national income. And we are saying that national income is the total income which has been earned by residents. So it's the total income which have been earned by the residents. And we are saying that the residents are going to be factor owners. They are going to be the ones who own the factors of production, which is then going to be utilized by the firm so that goods and services are actually produced. Now, let us just bear in mind quickly that these factor owners, they are either local or they might be abroad. And prudence would dictate that in order to get a true measure of what is happening, we would want to account for the income that is earned by those who are abroad. Now, GDP which is calculated by either output or by expenditure, which means the same thing as it's calculated at market price, would account for the income that is earned by the residents who are local. The residents who are abroad, we would need to account for their income by virtue of looking at the net factor income that is coming from abroad. And it's net because we're looking at the income of the residents who are abroad minus the income of the foreigners who are local. So let's bear that in mind. The other thing that we want to bear in mind is that whenever we're looking at income, we want it to be scoped to factor income. So this GDP here will then have to be converted to GDP at factor cost, which means that we need to account for the indirect taxes, which might be there, as well as the subsidies. And the quick way of doing it is to ask ourselves who gets what. So there are two things here. We have the indirect taxes and we have the subsidies. And if we're going from market price to factor cost, then we're asking ourselves, what does the factor owner actually get? So does the factor owner get taxes, the indirect taxes? And the answer is no. But we know that GDP at market price would account for those taxes because the consumer is actually paying more based on these taxes. So in order to find out what the factor owner actually obtains, we need to have the GDP at market price and we would subtract those taxes because those taxes are going to be remitted to the government by the sellers. So we want to get rid of that. That's not income to the factor owners. In terms of subsidies, though, the subsidies are not going to be included in the GDP at market price. Because remember, the consumer is going to pay less. They're paying less than the subsidies. So $5 million. The consumer pays, government pays $1 million, but the cost of the vehicle is $6 million. So it means that the subsidies are going to go to the factor owners. So if we are moving from GDP at market price to GDP at factor cost, then we need to remove the indirect taxes and we need to add the subsidies. So given all of that, if we then go back to our computation of national income, which we're saying we want it to be at factor cost, then national income is going to be GDP at market price, because there are two measures for GDP out of the three, which are treated at market price. GDP based on expenditure and GDP based on output. So we have that at the market price. But then we need to account for the taxes and subsidies so that we can get that to factor cost. So let's minus taxes, the indirect taxes, and let's add the subsidies. But this only accounts for a part of the equation. In other words, this is GDP at factor cost. But we also need to account for the persons who are abroad. What's their contribution? So therefore, we want to find the net factor income from abroad. So we're going to have to add that. But that's also part of the story. For the full story, we have to remember that money has to be set aside for depreciation. So the machinery will need to be replaced, or which will need to be repaired. So repaired now or replaced over time. So therefore, we need to get rid of the depreciation. And the end of all of this computation actually gives us what we call our net national product, or our net national income, which is expressed in terms of factor cost. So therefore, we can simply say that that is equal to GDP at factor cost plus the net factor income from abroad minus the depreciation. And if we want to, let's say, expand all of this, then just remember that GDP at factor cost is the same thing as GDP at market prices, less taxes, we add the subsidies, we add the net factor income from abroad, and we subtract depreciation. So this is just an expanded form to compute net factor income or net factor product. Since your syllabus uses the concept net national product, I think I said factor a while ago. So net national product, net national income. Since your syllabus uses the term net national product, let's keep that as our consistency. But if you stay on the exam paper, they are talking about NNI, net national income, you know that it means the same. And by default, when we're dealing with income, please remember that income we're talking about at factor cost by default. So there we have our expanded formula. Net national product is equal to gross domestic product minus taxes plus subsidies so that we can convert to factor cost, convert GDP to the factor cost. Plus, we want to account for the monies that is coming from our residents abroad. And then we want to take out the money that has been allocated for repair and replacement of the asset or the machinery. And that gives us our net national product. Now, in terms of our gross national product, once again, we're still talking about at factor cost. Then this will simply be equal to, in the expanded form, GDP at market price minus taxes plus subsidies plus we account for the net factor income from abroad, and we leave the depreciation inside of the value. So we do not adjust for depreciation. And that is what is important in terms of just doing the juggling with the arrangement of the formula so that we can see it in its different forms. Let's now quickly have a look at a problem. So I'm just going to grab the problem and carry it over. So just give me a few seconds while I get that done. And here we go. Here's our scenario. Alrighty. So we are looking at some data that relates to a country over a particular period. So this is 2025. And we are told that we want to calculate GDP, GNP, and NNP. So let's start out by computing GDP, sorry. So GDP. Well, there are three ways in which we can compute GDP. We can have GDP based on the output. We can have GDP based on expenditure, or we can also have GDP based on income. And the question that we're asking is, which one of these is appropriate based on the data that we have? So we know that we have expenditure data. Because we have expenditure data by the process of elimination, it means that we need to be looking at GDP-E, because there's no data for GDP-O and there's no data for GDP-I. So GDP-E is going to be equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus we are finding net exports. So remember, this is net exports. So what is consumption? Well, consumption is 800. What is investment? Investment is 250. What is the government expenditure? We are told that it is 150. What is the exports? Well, export is 120. And for imports, that's going to be 70. So these are expressed in terms of millions of dollars. So let's compute that. So it's 800 plus 250 plus 150. That is 1200. And then 120 minus 70. That gives us 50. So we add that 50 to the 1200. And that gives us 1250. Now remember, this is 1250 million, which is the same thing. Well, let me put it this way. Which is the same thing as saying 1.25 billion. All right, so that's GDP. And that's GDP that has been calculated based on the expenditure. The other thing that we will want to compute is the GNP, the gross national product. So remember, GNP, we are looking at income. And income is usually expressed in terms of the factor cost. So GNP is equal to GDP. So we have GDPE, which is at market price. Let's not forget that. This is at market price. And we also want to account for those persons who are abroad. So net factor income from abroad. But then remember, we also might need to make some adjustments. So we would want to get rid of the taxes because the taxes don't go to the factor owner. And we want to add the subsidies because the subsidies would go to the factor owner. So we already know what GDPE is. It's 1250. So what are we told about the factor income? Well, we are told that residents earn $60 million, but the foreigners who are domestic earn 20. So therefore means that we need to have 60, which is what the residents who are abroad earn, and we minus that 20. Then we want to get rid of the indirect taxes, but the problem does not tell us anything about indirect taxes. So we have to assume that there's none. So that's 0. And we now need to account for the subsidies. But once again, the problem does not tell us anything about subsidies. So once again, we assume that subsidies are going to be 0. So therefore means that we are now at 1250 plus 40, which ends up giving us 1290. Remember, this is 1290 million. So that's the gross national product. We now need to compute the net national product. So net national product. And remember, the net national product is going to be the GNP, the gross national product, less the money that has been allocated or put aside to repair and replace the machinery. So it means that we have to get rid of this money for depreciation, which is set aside for that use. So we know that our GNP is 1290. And we are going to look if there's anything for depreciation, and we are told it's 90 mil. So we do our subtraction, and that gives us 1200. Now remember, this is 1200 million, or 1.2 billion. So the final thing here is now to find the per capita income. And the per capita income is given by NNP divided by the population. So what is NNP? Well, NNP is 1,200 million and the population is 2 million. So when we do our division, we end up with 600. 600 what? 600 million. So we cannot forget the units. And this is telling us, based on the population, this is telling us that on a rough estimate, every person within the population is generating $600 million towards the productivity of the nation. Now, we know that there are some challenges with that, right? So, limitations. Because the population will account for persons who can't work. So we have some persons within the population who can't work. So they are not able to work. And we also have some persons who are not willing to work. So this concept of willing and able, the population is going to capture some of those persons who are not actually in the workforce. Therefore, it's not everybody who is contributing 600 million. And that's one of the limitations when we talk about, using national statistics. Another key limitation about national statistics is that it does not account for some things. So, for example, it does not account for how peaceful the society is, or how healthy the society is. And it doesn't do this because we're just looking at things from a monetary standpoint. How much has been generated in terms of final goods and services within the economy over this period of time. So you will find that whenever we look at national income statistics, there are going to be some things that it does not cater for properly. And that is why we have been consistent in saying that what we're looking at are economic models. And a model is a representation of reality. So we are trying to represent reality. Will we always get this representation 100%? And I mean, the answer obviously is a big fat no. But still, these models are useful so that we can have a general understanding or idea of what is taking place within the space. And this pretty much takes us to the end of Unit 2. And we will now prepare ourselves to move into Unit 3. So that's it for now. Take care. Until the next video.